Everything started with a Facebook post that seemed harmless at first. My name is Beverly, I am 32, and that evening I opened Facebook expecting nothing more than a few routine updates. Instead, I saw a post from my sister. She had shared a photo of a brand new Tesla carefully framed to signal success, paired with a caption claiming it was the result of hard work and personal discipline, emphasizing that she had achieved everything on her own without help from anyone else. The post spread quickly. Likes climbed within minutes, comments followed in the same admiring tone, and people repeated exactly the story my sister wanted them to believe. I read through each comment, realizing this was a very clean version of events, carefully curated, leaving out every part of the truth that was inconvenient to show in public. What bothered me was not the attention. It was how a single statement could erase years of quiet decisions I had made to keep family matters from being exposed. I understood that staying silent at that moment would mean accepting that version of the story. I reread the caption, scrolled through the comments, then typed a single reply directly under her post. I wrote, "You forgot to mention that car was bought with my savings. If you have ever stood between truth and silence, between family and personal boundaries, stay with this story. Do not forget to subscribe to follow everything that happened next, because what began as a social media post led to consequences none of us expected." After that comment, I stared at the screen and thought back to everything that had led to that moment. The truth did not begin with the car, and it did not begin online. It started earlier, during a period when my sister Marlene was struggling in ways the family rarely discussed directly. When I first stepped in, the decision felt reasonable. She was short on money, I was stable, and helping did not feel like a sacrifice that required formal rules or conditions. The earliest support was small and specific. One month, I covered a missed rent payment after she called me late, worried about an eviction notice. Another time, I paid off a credit card balance she said was temporary, promising it would only be for that billing cycle. There was also a stretch when I transferred money every few weeks, so she could keep up with car insurance and basic expenses while she waited for work to stabilize. None of it felt permanent in the moment. There were no written agreements and no conversations about limits. I assumed the support would taper off naturally, but instead, it became routine. The requests stopped sounding urgent and started sounding expected. Sometimes the money moved without a detailed explanation, framed as covering something already handled, or smoothing out a delay that would be resolved soon. Because nothing was questioned, the pattern continued uninterrupted. My father, Robert, and my mother, Susan, knew what was happening. I never hid it from them. When I mentioned covering rent or clearing a balance, their responses were neutral. They did not discourage it, but they did not step in to redirect responsibility either. That quiet approval made it easier for everyone to treat the situation as normal, even as the amounts and frequency increased. Marlene adjusted quickly to the arrangement. Updates became vague, framed as general stress rather than specific needs. I noticed that my role shifted from occasional help to silent backup. I chose not to confront it. Each time I held back, I told myself that raising concerns would only complicate family dynamics, and I convinced myself that keeping peace was worth the discomfort. Over time, the financial trail blurred. A few larger transfers were justified as temporary loans, though repayment was never revisited. Smaller amounts filled gaps that were no longer clearly defined. I tracked the numbers privately, aware that the total mattered, even if no one else acknowledged it. From the outside, everything appeared manageable, but the structure supporting it was fragile and entirely one-sided. The Tesla was not a sudden reward or a spontaneous decision. It was the visible endpoint of months of quiet financial flexibility. Down payments, timing, and affordability were all made possible because other obligations had already been absorbed elsewhere. When the photo appeared online, the groundwork had been laid incrementally, without transparency and without shared accountability. Sitting there after my comment, I realized that my silence had not preserved balance. It had allowed a version of reality to take shape where effort was highlighted and support was erased. The public story did not change the past, but it forced me to acknowledge how long I had been carrying something no one else wanted to name. A few days after I commented on that post, my phone started ringing nonstop. Mom was the first to reach out. Her voice was calm and controlled, as if the outcome had already been decided without needing my input. She did not ask whether what I wrote was accurate or whether there was financial context behind it. Instead, she focused on how the situation looked to people outside the family, how relatives might interpret it, and how strangers online were now discussing something she believed should have remained private. She said directly, "Do you realize how this makes our family look?" and followed it by saying that putting something like this in public only created unnecessary damage. I listened through the entire call without stepping in. Mom talked about embarrassment and reputation, about how people online never understand the full picture and only judge what they see. She said, "Public disagreement invites scrutiny and leaves marks that are difficult to erase." Before hanging up, she added, "Whether it is true or not is not the point right now. You should take the comment down." The expectation was clear. What needed correcting was the appearance, not the facts. Dad called later that same day. His tone was softer, slower, and more careful, but the direction of the conversation stayed largely the same. He said he understood why emotions might have run high and encouraged me to think about the bigger picture. He talked about long-term peace and avoiding situations that spiral beyond control. "We already have enough going on as a family," he said. "There is no reason to make things harder than they need to be." According to him, removing the comment would help calm things down before they went further. I noticed how deliberately he avoided the substance of what I had said. He did not dispute it, but he did not acknowledge it either. The focus remained on smoothing things over, as if deleting a single line could restore balance. I responded carefully, letting him know I heard his concerns, then allowed the call to end without promising anything. Marlene never contacted me directly. Instead, her presence entered every conversation through interpretation. Mom said Marlene was overwhelmed and deeply hurt that the attention had been more than she could handle. Dad mentioned that Marlene felt blindsided and misunderstood. Through their words, she was positioned as the one absorbing the impact while I became the source of disruption. What stood out most was what no one asked. Neither of them questioned whether my statement was accurate. There were no requests for clarification, no interest in a private explanation. The only issue that mattered was whether I would delete the comment. Truth seemed secondary to containment. During those days, I chose to listen more than respond. I wanted to understand what each person prioritized when confronted with discomfort. For Mom, it was appearance and unity, even if that meant overlooking inconvenient realities. For Dad, it was calm and avoidance, even if accountability was delayed. Marlene's voice filtered through them, centered entirely on being hurt, without acknowledging what led there. The pressure was subtle, but persistent. I was reminded that families make allowances, that public conflict leaves lasting impressions, and that silence is often easier for everyone involved. These suggestions were framed as reasonable and protective, yet none of them addressed who had been carrying the weight long before anything was said out loud. As the calls slowed and eventually stopped, nothing had been resolved in the traditional sense. Something had shifted instead. For the first time, I was no longer managing the narrative on behalf of everyone else. I stepped back and watched how each person reacted when I stopped doing that for them, and that absence revealed more than any argument ever could. By that weekend, everything started moving beyond the boundaries of family. People I had not spoken to in years began to notice the post. Some were distant relatives. Others were former co-workers of Marlene. A few were neighbors who had seen the car in passing but never questioned how it appeared so suddenly. The attention shifted in tone. Instead of admiration, curiosity crept in. Questions surfaced quietly at first, phrased carefully in comment threads and private messages. Someone asked whether the purchase was financed. Another wondered aloud how the timing lined up with recent changes in Marlene's work situation. None of them accused her directly, yet the certainty that had fueled the praise earlier was no longer there. My comment did not stay confined to that single post. Screenshots began circulating, shared in group chats, and forwarded between people who recognized names or details. I learned this indirectly through messages that landed in my inbox, some neutral, others cautiously supportive, a few simply asking whether what I had written was accurate. At that point, the story no longer belonged to Marlene. It existed independently, shaped by fragments saved and passed along beyond her reach. Marlene realized this almost immediately. She deleted the original post sometime that Saturday morning, then removed several older photos that hinted at a timeline she no longer wanted examined. The disappearance of the post only drew more attention. Copies resurfaced within hours, complete with timestamps and comment sections intact. Deleting it had not erased anything. It only confirmed that something was worth hiding. That was when panic set in. Messages were sent, then unsent. I could see her activity spike, then vanish. Through my parents, I learned that Marlene was trying to track where the screenshots had come from, asking who had shared them, insisting that the situation had been taken out of context. She framed it as a misunderstanding that had grown legs, something that could still be corrected if people would stop talking. The problem was that no one was waiting for permission anymore. My parents began to sense the shift as well. Their earlier confidence that silence would contain the issue faded once neighbors mentioned the post in passing and relatives reached out with awkward questions. Mom stopped framing the situation as a private disagreement and started asking how far the screenshots had spread. Dad asked whether I had heard from anyone outside the family. Neither of them blamed Marlene openly, yet it was clear they understood that control had slipped. Throughout all of this, I stayed out of it. I did not respond to messages asking for clarification. I did not add context to my original comment. I did not step in to correct exaggerations or defend myself. The truth did not need my help anymore. It was already moving, shaped by what people could see and compare on their own. What struck me most was how quickly perception changed once information stopped being curated. The same people who had praised discipline and independence days earlier were now quiet or cautious. Some removed their own comments from the original post. Others asked questions privately, careful not to leave a visible trail. The confidence that had protected Marlene's image relied on everyone accepting the story as complete. Once that assumption cracked, everything built on it weakened. My role during that weekend was passive by design. I observed how narratives behave once released into open space, how quickly control dissolves when documentation exists beyond a single platform. I also watched how my parents adjusted, slowly recognizing that avoiding confrontation had only delayed this moment rather than prevented it. The following week, I made the decision I had been avoiding for a long time. I did not announce it. I did not frame it as a statement or a warning. I simply stopped. The transfers that had quietly gone out at predictable intervals did not happen. The small adjustments I used to make without thinking, covering shortfalls before they became problems, were no longer part of my routine. I treated the decision the same way I treated every other financial boundary in my own life, by changing my actions rather than explaining them into exhaustion. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final message spelling out reasons, because I knew from experience that explanations only invited negotiations I was no longer willing to entertain. It did not take long for the absence to be noticed. Marlene had grown used to the rhythm of support, even if it was rarely acknowledged directly. When that rhythm broke, the silence became loud. Messages started arriving that were carefully worded at first, checking whether something had gone wrong on my end or whether there had been a delay. There was an assumption underneath every question that this was temporary, that whatever had interrupted the flow would soon be corrected. When days passed without the usual correction, the tone shifted from confusion to irritation, then to urgency. That was when the family dynamic began to show itself more clearly. The gap left by my withdrawal forced everyone to look at how much had been resting on it. Bills that had been manageable before suddenly became problems that needed solving. Plans that depended on quiet financial cushioning stalled. What had once been framed as occasional help revealed itself as a structural support that no one wanted to name out loud. I did not point this out to anyone, but the change exposed it more effectively than any argument could have. The pressure from Mom increased first. She called with concern layered over frustration, speaking about stress stability and the need to prevent further fallout. Her words circled around consequences rather than causes. She talked about how hard the last week had been for everyone, how fragile things already felt, how this was not the time to add more strain. The implication was clear even when it was not spoken directly, which was that my decision was creating problems that could have been avoided if I had simply continued as before. Dad followed with a different approach, quieter but persistent. He framed it as a practical issue, asking whether this pause was permanent or whether there was room to reconsider. He spoke about smoothing things over and avoiding long-term damage, emphasizing that families recover by making allowances rather than drawing lines. Neither of them asked what had led me to this point. Neither questioned whether the arrangement had been fair or sustainable. Their concern was focused on managing the outcome, not understanding the boundary. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I needed to hear the full shape of their response. It confirmed what I already suspected. The support had stopped being seen as a choice a long time ago. It had become an expectation woven so tightly into the family structure that removing it felt like a disruption rather than a decision. That realization settled something in me. It made the path forward clearer instead of more complicated. I did not negotiate. I did not offer partial solutions or temporary compromises. I did not step back into the familiar role of smoothing edges and absorbing discomfort so others would not have to. My decision stayed in place, unchanged by urgency or appeals to harmony. For the first time in a long while, I allowed the consequences to land where they belonged, rather than redirecting them away from myself. As the week continued, the tension did not disappear, but it shifted. The expectation that I would eventually relent began to weaken. Conversations became shorter. The urgency dulled into something closer to resignation. I noticed the change not because anyone acknowledged it openly, but because the pressure lost its rhythm the same way support once had. That week marked a quiet turning point. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface, but underneath the balance had changed. I was no longer financing a version of stability that depended on my silence. I had stepped out of a role that had been assigned to me without my consent, and even though the adjustment unsettled everyone involved, I did not step back. For the first time, the absence of my support was not an accident to be fixed, but a boundary that was meant to stay. About a month later, the consequences began to show clearly. Marlene was the first to feel it in practical ways that could not be brushed aside. Bills that had always been covered without discussion started stacking up. The car payment that looked manageable on paper became a monthly stress once late fees appeared. Insurance notices arrived with tighter deadlines. Credit card balances that had been kept just below alarming levels began to creep higher because the usual quiet cushion was gone. She tried adjusting by delaying payments, then by asking for extensions, but the rhythm she depended on had disappeared, leaving little room to improvise. When those measures failed, she turned to Mom and Dad. It was not framed as a crisis at first. It sounded like temporary help to bridge a gap. A few groceries here, a utility bill there, then a request to cover a payment so her credit would not take a hit. What surprised them was not the requests themselves, but their frequency. Within weeks, they were handling expenses they had never directly seen before. They learned how much the monthly car costs were, what the insurance premiums looked like, how often unexpected charges showed up. The support I once managed quietly now sat squarely on their shoulders. That shift changed the atmosphere immediately. Conversations at family gatherings became careful, edged with calculation. Someone would mention a plan, then hesitate, doing mental math out loud. Assumptions that once held no longer fit. The idea that everything was under control fell apart as soon as my parents tried to replicate what I had been smoothing over for years. They were not prepared for how quickly small commitments turned into ongoing obligations. The tension did not stay contained. Mom began calling more often, sounding tired rather than upset. She talked about rising costs, about how quickly things added up, about feeling blindsided by responsibilities she never realized existed. Dad grew quieter, more withdrawn, measuring his words as if each one had a price attached. Their frustration needed a place to land, and it found one. I became the reason things felt unstable, the person who had changed the rules without warning, even though the rules had never been discussed openly to begin with. I noticed how the language shifted. Instead of asking how Marlene would adjust, the question became why I had stepped away. Instead of examining the structure that depended on my silence, the focus turned to my refusal to continue it. I was described as inflexible, as someone who had created unnecessary strain. The fact that I had not caused the imbalance only exposed it, rarely entered the conversation. It was easier to point at the moment support stopped than to acknowledge how long it had been assumed. As this played out, my distance from the family widened in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. I was no longer included in casual planning. Updates reached me secondhand. When I did speak, responses felt guarded, as if my presence itself complicated matters. I realized that my role had never been just financial. It had been emotional insulation, a buffer that allowed everyone else to avoid uncomfortable truths. Without that buffer, relationships shifted under the weight of reality. By the end of that month, nothing had exploded publicly, but the consequences were undeniable. The household felt tighter, conversations shorter, patience thinner. I stood further away than before, not because I wanted distance for its own sake, but because proximity now required me to resume a role I no longer accepted. The clarity that came with stepping back carried a cost measured in colder interactions and fewer invitations, yet it also confirmed something important. The problem had always existed. I had simply stopped hiding it. That morning did not begin with raised voices or dramatic gestures, but with a tension that had been building for weeks, the kind that made every movement feel measured and restrained. My parents had requested a face-to-face conversation, saying it was time to address what had been hanging over the family before it caused more damage. I showed up knowing exactly why I was there, and also realizing that this meeting was less about facts than about discomfort no one could continue to avoid. Marlene sat across from me and went straight to the point. She said I had crossed a line by letting something private spill into public view, framing the issue around exposure rather than the reality that had existed long before the post. The way she spoke positioned me as the one who chose attention over loyalty, even though attention had never been my goal. In her version of events, the problem began with my comment, not with the years of arrangements that made the situation possible. She looked directly at me and said, "I never thought you would choose to humiliate me in front of everyone like that." I listened until she finished, then answered with the only sentence that mattered. "I didn't make it public. I stopped hiding it." The room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than shouting, because that sentence left no space for pretending this was just a misunderstanding. It was not an accusation, and it was not an apology. It was a boundary stated plainly. Dad spoke next, his tone calmer and more deliberate, trying to bring the conversation back to familiar ground. He talked about how families survive through sacrifice, how conflict fades when people are willing to give a little for the greater good. He looked at me and said, "You may be right, but do you really want to be the one who tears this family apart?" The words were meant to soften the moment, yet they carried the same expectation I had lived with for years, that I would be the one to bend again. Mom focused on Marlene's emotions, emphasizing how overwhelmed and hurt she felt by the attention the situation had drawn, as if emotional fallout mattered more than the structure that caused it. As they spoke, it became clear that no one was asking whether what I said was true. What mattered to them was whether it had been necessary. The discussion revolved around appearances, discomfort, and damage control, never touching the foundation that had allowed this dependence to grow unchecked. I let them speak without interruption, then said this meeting was not about persuading anyone or defending myself. It was about clarity, and clarity does not negotiate with denial. I stated clearly that I would not continue any financial arrangements, formal or informal, regardless of how difficult the transition might be. I said it without listing past sacrifices or reopening old arguments, because the decision itself no longer required explanation. The silence that followed felt different as everyone began to understand this was not temporary. Marlene reacted with frustration, saying I was abandoning the family at the moment they needed support most. Mom asked whether I understood how much harder this would make things in the coming months. I answered that difficulty does not disappear just because it is hidden, and that stopping did not create a problem, it revealed one. I made it clear I was not asking for permission and not issuing an ultimatum. This was the end of my role in a system that relied on my silence to function. Dad made one final attempt at compromise, but there was nothing left to negotiate once the boundary had been drawn. When the conversation ended, there was no sense of resolution, only the recognition that something fundamental had shifted. We left the room without hugs or reassurance, each of us carrying a different understanding of what had just happened. For me, the outcome was clear, even if the emotions were not simple. I had said what needed to be said, drawn a line that had been avoided for too long, and accepted that clarity sometimes comes at the cost of comfort. Sometime later, my life became quiet in a way it had never been before. That quiet did not arrive all at once, and it was not dramatic, but it settled in gradually as I stepped out of the family's constant orbit. I did not disappear overnight or announce a clean break. I simply stopped orbiting around problems that were never mine to carry, and with distance came a clarity that had been impossible before. Phone calls became less frequent visits, shorter conversations more careful, and for the first time, those changes did not feel like losses. They felt intentional, shaped by choice, rather than obligation. Without the familiar financial cushion, Marlene had to recalibrate her life in ways she had long postponed. The lifestyle she once maintained through quiet support now demanded visible adjustments. Some expenses disappeared, others were scaled back, and decisions that had once been optional suddenly required planning. There was frustration in that process and resentment too, but it was no longer something I was asked to absorb or fix. She learned slowly and unevenly what her actual limits looked like when they were not softened by someone else stepping in behind the scenes. My parents were forced into a position they had avoided for years, which was confronting choices instead of deferring them. They could no longer rely on the assumption that I would stabilize things quietly when tension appeared. Bill's expectations and consequences now landed directly in their hands, and that shift made them uncomfortable. I could hear it in their voices when we spoke, the uncertainty mixed with a subtle frustration that I was no longer smoothing everything out. For the first time, they had to decide whether to intervene, to step back, or to let outcomes unfold without interference. That discomfort changed the family dynamic more than any argument ever had. Long-standing assumptions stopped working once the structure supporting them was gone. I was no longer the silent solution, yet I became the easiest explanation for why things felt harder. It was simpler to frame me as the source of the disruption than to acknowledge how dependent the arrangement had become over time. Being cast in that role no longer felt unbearable because I finally understood it was a reflection of the shift, not proof that my decision was wrong. As the weeks passed, my own life began to stabilize in ways that felt grounded rather than performative. My finances were predictable, my time was my own, and my energy was no longer drained by managing invisible responsibilities. Decisions became lighter when they no longer required checking how they might ripple through the family system. Even ordinary routines felt different when they were not shaped by constant anticipation of someone else's needs. The calm was not perfect or permanent, but it was real. The distance between me and my family became clearer with time, not sharper, but more defined. We spoke occasionally carefully without pretending things were the same as before. There was no reconciliation scene, no emotional resolution that tied everything neatly together. What existed instead was a boundary that held even when it made conversations awkward or silences longer than they used to be. That boundary did not demand agreement from anyone else to remain valid. I learned that peace does not always come from being understood, and closure does not always look like forgiveness or reunion. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to step back into a role that cost too much, even when others would prefer the comfort of the old arrangement. My story did not end with harmony restored or relationships repaired in the way people often expect. It ended with something quieter, more stable, and more honest. I did not walk away with triumph, and I did not stay with regret. I walked forward with clarity, knowing that holding a boundary can be an ending of one chapter and the beginning of a life that finally belongs to you.